What if vengeance didn't come with a weapon, but with a needle? What if death didn't strike with violence, but in the quiet silence of a seam woven into the fabric of everyday life? In 1853, Tennessee, a wealthy family slowly started to die, one by one, as their clothes, perfectly sewn and meticulously repaired, became the silent harbinger of death. The woman behind the needle, Louisa, was an enslaved seamstress, unseen, unheard, and most dangerously, unnoticed. But what secrets did she carry in her quiet hands? Why didn't anyone see it coming? Today, we explore the chilling and heartbreaking tale of Louisa, a woman who turned her craft into a quiet rebellion, a rebellion that would leave an entire family in ruins. But who was Louisa? Was she a witch, a martyr, or something far more complex? Someone who sowed death not out of hate, but for justice? Stay with us as we uncover a story that blurs the lines between myth and truth. Before we dive deep, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss out on more chilling stories like this. It was the kind of day that seemed too heavy for even the air to bear. The Tennessee summer of 1853 clung to the skin like a thick, damp sheet. The vast plantation house stood at the top of a hill, its white columns stark against the backdrop of green. The house, once the center of wealth and social standing, now felt like a monument to something darker, a place where secrets were buried in the floorboards just beneath the surface. Inside, the family moved through the day as if nothing was amiss. The mistress, a soft-spoken woman with eyes like faded blue glass, sipped her afternoon tea with an air of quiet sophistication. The master, tall and imposing in his dark vestments, adjusted his hat as he surveyed his estate. But in their midst, there was an undeniable tension, an energy in the air that couldn't be ignored. Louisa, the enslaved seamstress, moved through the halls with an eerie grace, her presence barely noticed by the family. Her fingers, steady and meticulous, guided needle and thread through fabric that would become the very clothes the family wore. The dresses, the vests, the fine linens, they all passed through Louisa's hands. And with each stitch, a silent decision was made. Louisa's quarters were tucked away in the back of the house where the light barely reached. The other enslaved women worked beside her, stitching under the harsh supervision of the mistress, but Louisa seemed almost untouchable. Her quiet demeanor earned her the position, her skill with a needle keeping her away from the harshness of field labor. But there was something different about her. Her hands were steady, yes, but her eyes, those dark, distant eyes, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Louisa did not speak much. She didn't need to. Her silence was her power. Her skill, her precision, were her rebellion. The family began to fall ill in subtle ways. The mistress first noticed a rash on her wrist, which she brushed off as an insect bite, but it persisted. Then the children, once full of energy and life, started to complain of aches, chills, and fatigue that lingered longer than expected. Even the master seemed affected, growing irritable and distant, his sharp eyes clouded with an inexplicable confusion. Their symptoms were dismissed as nothing more than the summer fever or perhaps bad water from the local well, but they only worsened with time. Through it all, Louisa continued to sew, her fingers working the fabric with quiet determination. No one suspected that her hands carried anything but thread. No one could have known that each stitch, each seam, held more than just fabric. It held vengeance, carefully sewn into the very clothes the family wore. No one saw it coming. Not yet. Not until it was too late. Days passed, and with each one, the symptoms of the White family worsened. What had started as mild discomfort soon escalated into something far more sinister. The mistress, once a picture of composure, found herself confined to her bed, her skin blotched with unexplained lesions. Her breath, shallow and ragged, barely escaped her lips. The children, once bright-eyed and full of life, had become pale, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their small bodies racked with tremors. The master, who had always carried himself with a sense of unwavering control, was now a shell of his former self, irritable and weak, his mind slipping in and out of coherence. The family physician, a man who had served the household for years, was called in once more. He was punctual, methodical, and always had an answer for every ailment. This time, however, he was baffled. He quickly ruled out the summer fever, dismissing it as the symptoms didn't align with what he'd seen in previous outbreaks. He suggested the water was tainted or perhaps a local infection, but nothing explained the odd rashes, the persistent nausea, the confusion. He prescribed herbal remedies and insisted that the family rest, hoping the symptoms would subside. Yet, nothing seemed to improve. The family continued to waste away, their strength seeping from them like the life from a dying flame. In the corners of the household, whispers began to stir. Among the enslaved workers, there was an uncomfortable tension. The ones who had spent the most time handling the family's clothing, the ones who came in contact with the fabrics Louisa so carefully repaired, began to show signs of illness, too. A maid collapsed after wearing a shawl that had just been mended by Louisa's hand. A stable boy developed strange ulcers after carrying a pile of freshly laundered coats. No one dared speak openly of what they feared, but behind closed doors, rumors were already starting to swirl. Some of the older women whispered that Louisa's work might not be as innocent as it appeared. Louisa, for her part, remained untouched. She carried on with her work, day after day, her fingers sewing, stitching, mending. Her eyes never wavered from her task, never betraying a hint of emotion. She was as silent as the grave, as constant as the moon, her movements steady, mechanical. The others looked at her with a mix of fear and curiosity. Some distanced themselves from her, convinced that something darker was at play. Others, though, began to watch her more closely, noticing the way her hands never trembled, the way her lips never parted. Her silence was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Meanwhile, the master's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His once commanding presence was now reduced to a wandering, paranoid figure who muttered to himself and accused his own children of betrayal. His eyes darted nervously around the house, scanning for a threat that seemed to exist only in his fevered mind. His skin had turned a sickly yellow, his face gaunt, and his breath came in ragged gasps. And yet, despite all of this, the one person who remained unaffected was Louisa. She kept sewing, never pausing, never faltering. But in her silence, there was power, power that no one could see. And the family, so certain of their control, was about to find out that they had underestimated the quietest force in the house. As the days stretched into weeks, the family's decline became impossible to ignore. The mistress, once the elegant face of the house, now lay in a near-comatose state, her body ravaged by the mysterious ailment. The children, who had once filled the house with laughter and energy, were now reduced to shadows of their former selves. The youngest daughter was the first to succumb, her small body stiff and cold in the bed, the air heavy with a silence that only death can bring. No one spoke of it aloud, but the fear in the house grew palpable. The family physician, unable to explain the mounting symptoms, was forced to confront the unthinkable, the possibility of poison. A new theory began to form in the physician's mind as he observed the family's suffering. He couldn't ignore the strange pattern of their illnesses, how their symptoms seemed to mirror each other and worsen after coming into contact with their clothing. It wasn't just the family who had fallen ill. Their servants were showing signs of sickness as well, all of them linked by the garments they wore, the ones Louisa had repaired and altered. The physician, now deeply troubled, turned his attention to the clothes themselves. Something wasn't right. There were small oily spots between the folds of the fabrics, faint discolorations along the seams, and a bitter odor that lingered in the air whenever one of the garments was worn. Despite his growing suspicion, the physician's tests came back inconclusive. There were no traces of arsenic or any known toxins in the family's food or water, yet the symptoms remained. He ordered the clothes to be examined more closely, collecting samples of the fabrics that had been worn by the afflicted family members. Under a rudimentary microscope, he could see something that unsettled him, a strange, oily residue. He couldn't identify it, but the presence of such a substance was undeniable. He began to fear the worst, that the poison wasn't in the food or drink, but in the very clothes the family wore. But still, no one could explain how or why this was happening. Meanwhile, Louisa continued her work, her hands steady and precise. She remained an enigma, neither a suspect nor a visible part of the mystery. Her silence was a shroud that cloaked her from suspicion, and no one thought to question her. To the outside world, she was simply the seamstress, the woman who mended clothes and embroidered linens. But to those who worked closely with her, her presence seemed more ominous. Rumors began to spread in whispers, fueled by the growing realization that something beyond the ordinary was at play. Some of the enslaved workers began to wonder, could Louisa be using something in her work, something hidden within the stitches and seams? The plantation, once a place of bustling activity, now felt like a tomb. The air inside the house was thick with fear, the servants moving through the halls like ghosts, careful not to disturb the growing tension. The White family's decline was now a certainty, and Louisa's role in it was becoming impossible to ignore. But she remained untouched, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she sewed the garments that would carry the poison deeper into the family's veins. No one could see it, but in the quiet of the sewing room, Louisa's vengeance was being stitched into every thread. To understand Louisa's actions, we must first understand who she was before the plantation, before the needle, and before the family began to die. Louisa had not always been silent or composed. She was born into bondage in North Carolina, sold away from her family at just 14, sent to a life she never asked for, a life no child should endure. The ledger from her previous owner had few details about her early life, just a brief note about her being punished for some vague disciplinary incident, an unspoken transgression that was never fully explained. Some rumors suggested that the boy who had hurt her had met an untimely death, his body found stiff and convulsing, a silent witness to the first seed of her quiet defiance. When Louisa was sold to a plantation in Tennessee, she carried with her a history of silence, a history that no one had ever bothered to question. Her new master was an ambitious man, eager to expand his wealth, and his home, like so many others, was built on the labor of enslaved men and women. Louisa was brought to the big house, not to work in the fields, but to serve in a different capacity. She was taken under the wing of the house mistress, whose temper was cold and whose expectations were high. The mistress quickly recognized Louisa's skill with a needle and tasked her with the delicate work of mending garments, embroidering linens, and sewing fine dresses. But beneath Louisa's practiced hands was a mind that had learned the lessons of survival early. She didn't just learn to sew, she learned to observe, to listen, and to remember. The work she did, the labor she performed day after day, gave her access to something far more powerful than a needle and thread. In the sewing room, Louisa began to observe the rhythms of the house. She watched the family move, listened to the quiet conversations that were often forgotten by the time they left the parlor. She learned the ways of her masters, but more importantly, she learned the ways of resistance. It was during these early years in Tennessee that Louisa met Bet, an older enslaved woman who worked as a midwife. Bet's hands trembled with age, but her knowledge was vast. She knew the old ways of herbal medicine and the powerful, dangerous plants that could bring death as easily as life. She taught Louisa the secrets of the land, the herbs, roots, and berries that could be used to heal, but also to harm. Bet spoke of plants that killed slowly, subtly, their effects not immediately obvious but lethal when used in precise doses. Louisa listened carefully, memorizing every word, every plant name, every warning. Bet's teachings became a whispered ritual, a tradition passed from one generation to the next among the enslaved women. Louisa, ever the quiet student, absorbed it all. She learned how to use the poisons of the earth, how to mix them with the fabrics that her mistress and master would wear. The family never suspected a thing. They never suspected the quiet seamstress, sitting at her needle, working with an intimacy no one else could see. And as Louisa's hands grew more skilled with the needle, so too did her knowledge of the plants that could bring them to ruin. What had begun as a means of survival soon became something much more. An act of defiance stitched carefully into the very clothes the family wore. As Louisa's silence deepened, the house around her began to shudder with unspoken tension. The once bustling halls of the plantation, filled with the laughter of children and the clink of fine china, now echoed with the heavy sound of uncertainty. The White family's sickness spread like a dark shadow, each passing day revealing more signs of decline. The air within the house grew thick with suspicion, as the symptoms of the family's illness became impossible to ignore. Their pallor, their listlessness, their whispered conversations in the corners of rooms. They were all signs that something deeper and more sinister was at work. The enslaved workers, who once moved through the house with an air of careful indifference, began to speak in hushed tones. The rumors, which had started as small whispers, grew louder and more desperate with each passing day. Some of the women who had worked closest to Louisa began to wonder if the illness had something to do with the clothes they wore. Clothes that were always mended, embroidered, and altered by Louisa's hands. No one dared to speak outright of poison, but the possibility lingered in the air like a thick fog, something just beneath the surface that could no longer be ignored. Those who had worked the most closely with Louisa, the ones who had worn the garments she had repaired, or the ones who had touched the fine fabric she had stitched, began to show signs of illness. A maid, who had been wearing a shawl that Louisa had mended just days before, collapsed, her face pale and her breathing labored. A stable boy, who had carried a stack of coats that Louisa had laundered, developed painful sores on his skin that refused to heal. These incidents, though small, were enough to set the house on edge. The family, once proud and filled with certainty, now stood on the precipice of fear. But Louisa remained unaffected. She continued to sew in silence, her hands working with the same precision they always had. Her demeanor, calm and composed, contrasted sharply with the growing panic around her. The other enslaved workers began to wonder if she was untouched by the illness, because she had some knowledge the others did not. Perhaps she was immune, or perhaps she was behind it all. Some feared her, keeping their distance, while others left small offerings at her door, pieces of thread, beads, and roots, silent acknowledgments of a power they didn't fully understand. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't quite put their fingers on it. Among the family, the whispers grew louder. The master, once so sure of his dominance, had begun to unravel. His mind seemed to slip further from his grasp each day. His behavior grew more erratic. He shouted at shadows, accused his own children of betrayal, and refused to let anyone near him. His eyes grew sunken, his skin pale, and the rest of the family seemed to follow suit. The physician, unable to diagnose the true cause of their sickness, began to question the source of the family's decline. His suspicions turned toward Louisa, but without any evidence, he could not take action. No one dared confront her, for in her quiet stillness, Louisa had become an enigma, an unspoken threat hidden in plain sight. As the days wore on, the family's descent into madness became undeniable. The master, once a towering figure of control and authority, now staggered through the house as if he were a shadow of his former self. His movements had become jerky and erratic, his once sharp gaze now clouded with confusion and fear. His skin had yellowed, and his once composed demeanor was now replaced with frantic outbursts. He would shout at the servants for no reason, accuse his children of conspiring against him, and mutter nonsensical words to himself when no one was around. The house that had once been ruled by his cold command was now suffocating under his uncertainty. Even the mistress, who had always maintained a semblance of grace, was not immune. She lay bedridden, her once lustrous hair thinning, her face hollowed by an illness no one could explain. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her eyes, once so clear and sharp, had become distant, unfocused. She would clutch at the sheets, her fingers trembling, whispering of a weight beneath her skin, of a fire that seemed to burn from the inside out. The children, too, seemed to slip further from reality. The youngest son had lost all his energy, his body wasting away despite efforts to nourish him. The eldest, once poised to inherit the estate, refused to leave his room, claiming he could feel something moving beneath his skin, something crawling, something alive inside him. As the family's condition worsened, the physician, who had once remained optimistic, began to lose hope. His theories became more and more desperate. He had examined every possible cause for the family's decline: tainted water, fever, local infections. Yet nothing fit. He had seen sickness before, but this was different. It wasn't just the family that was affected, it was the entire household. Servants who had been in close contact with the family's clothing or bedding also began to exhibit signs of illness. Their skin broke out in strange rashes, and their bodies ached with fatigue. The family's decline was now a certainty. There was only one question left: what was causing it? The physician's suspicions finally led him to the garments, Louisa's garments. The oily residue that had been found in the fabrics, the strange discolorations, the faint bitter odor that clung to the clothes, all pointed to one conclusion: poison. But the question remained: how? How had the poison found its way into the clothes? No one could explain it. The garments were perfectly stitched, without flaw. There was no visible evidence of foul play, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Yet the illness was real. The deaths were real. The family's decline could no longer be explained by simple coincidence. Meanwhile, Louisa remained an invisible presence in the house. She never faltered. Her hands moved steadily, sewing and mending, her silence unbroken. She was untouchable, shielded by the mundane nature of her work. No one dared question the seamstress who sat quietly at her bench, her dark eyes watching the chaos around her, but saying nothing. The others in the household had begun to fear her, even though they could not pinpoint why. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, unnoticed and yet somehow at the center of it all. Louisa's presence became more than just a comfort to the family. It was a reminder of everything they had taken, everything they had stolen, and everything that was now slipping through their fingers. As the family's symptoms continued to worsen, the whispers around the plantation grew louder. The physician, his mind desperate for answers, sought out every possible solution. He dug deeper into his theories, revisiting every test, every possible environmental factor, but nothing fit. The fever that had been his initial assumption was no longer a viable explanation. And yet the sickness continued. Each day another member of the family would fall further into delirium or death, and still no one could explain why. The plantation had become a place of quiet terror, its halls filled with an air of uncertainty. It was then that Dr. Albert Greaves, a physician from Charleston with a reputation for diagnosing ailments that others could not, was summoned. Greaves was a man of science, trained in the best medical schools of the time, and he approached every case with a meticulous, logical mind. He arrived at the plantation with an air of skepticism, certain that a proper diagnosis would reveal the truth. But as he stepped through the door of the grand house, even he could feel that something was wrong. an intangible weight in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Dr. Graves began his examination with methodical precision. He studied the afflicted family members, documenting their symptoms and collecting samples of their blood, skin, and urine. But his clinical examination did little to explain the deeper mystery. The signs pointed to some form of poisoning, yet there was no clear cause. As he moved through the house, he took special interest in the family's clothing. There was something off about the garments: discoloration, a stiffening of the fabric, an odor that didn't belong. He began to suspect that the poison might be hidden in the clothes themselves, but still, he couldn't prove it. Greaves ordered that none of the family members wear clothes that had been in contact with Louisa's work, hoping that, by removing the garments from the equation, the sickness would slow or stop altogether. But the damage had already been done. The family's condition did not improve. He requested that Louisa's quarters be searched, but there was little to find. Her room, though simple, was meticulously clean, with only the most basic of sewing tools scattered across her workspace. No traces of poison were found, and yet the suspicion that Louisa was involved continued to grow. The servants, who had been watching her more closely, began to gossip. They spoke of strange things they had witnessed, of Louisa speaking to someone who was not there, of her strange quietude, of the way she seemed to move through the house without ever really being seen. But Louisa remained unfazed. She did not speak when questioned. She did not react when the overseer's men tore through her quarters. She simply continued to sew, her hands steady, her gaze distant. The family, however, was running out of time. The overseer, fearful of what was happening and desperate for answers, began to push for action. His accusations grew louder. Some servants whispered that Louisa had been using some kind of witchcraft, while others feared she was using the old poisons taught to her by Bet, the midwife. But no one could prove it. No one could find the evidence they needed to stop her. And so Louisa remained untouched, her silence growing heavier with each passing day. As the family's decline stretched on, the tension in the plantation house reached a breaking point. The once magnificent estate, full of life and laughter, now felt like a prison. The halls echoed with the sound of footsteps that shuffled rather than strode, and the air was thick with dread. The family's last hope lay in Dr. Graves's hands, but his efforts had proven fruitless. The family's health continued to deteriorate, and the suspicion surrounding Louisa grew more pronounced with each passing day. The rumors about her role in the sickness became impossible to ignore. The overseer, driven by fear and frustration, decided that the time for questioning was over. He needed to act. One evening, the overseer stormed into Louisa's quarters, his face set with determination. He had made up his mind. Louisa would be arrested. The servants, who had remained silent until now, watched with a mixture of fear and fascination as the overseer ordered Louisa to stand. His words were harsh, but Louisa remained calm. She did not flinch or show any sign of emotion. She simply looked up at him with those same unreadable eyes, as if the storm around her did not touch her. The overseer's men grabbed her roughly, pulling her out of the room and down the dark, narrow corridors of the plantation house. No one spoke a word as they escorted her to the storage room, a small, dank place beneath the house where cloth was stored, and where no one dared go unless they had to. The overseer, who had been so quick to accuse her, now stood in the cold, dimly lit room with Louisa. He demanded that she confess to using poison, confess to poisoning the family with her stitching, confess to the deaths that had followed. But Louisa remained silent, her eyes never leaving his face, her lips pressed together in a firm line. She did not deny the accusations, nor did she confirm them. Her silence hung in the air like an unspoken verdict. The overseer's frustration boiled over, but there was nothing he could do. Without proof, he could not act. He had no evidence, only suspicion. The rest of the household, however, was not so silent. The servants gathered in hushed groups, exchanging fearful glances and whispers. Some believed that Louisa had brought this upon herself, while others feared that the family's illness was just the beginning of something far darker. They spoke of witchcraft, of old poisons, of vengeful spirits. The fear that had been growing for weeks now turned into open suspicion. Many had already begun to avoid Louisa, staying far away from the garments she had sewn or mended. They could not shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play, something that went beyond illness and misfortune. Despite the mounting tension, Louisa said nothing. She did not try to explain herself or defend her actions. Her silence was her shield, and no one knew how to break it. When food was slipped to her through the door of the small room where she was locked away, the cook reported seeing Louisa sitting cross-legged on the floor, quietly whispering to herself. It was not a prayer. It was something else, something no one could understand. Some of the older servants believed that she was speaking to the spirits of those who had been wronged, to the ancestors who had suffered before her. But even in her silence, Louisa held power. The family, their fate sealed by their own cruelty, had unwittingly become part of a much larger, older story, one that had been written in the stitches of every garment she had sewn. One night, the air in the plantation house was thick with the kind of tension that comes before a storm. The weather had been unrelenting, with gusts of wind howling through the trees and dark clouds rolling across the sky. The family, holed up in their rooms, could hear the distant thunder rumbling like a warning. But it wasn't the storm that would cause the next shift in their fates. It was the fire. It started in the far shed, a small outbuilding used for storing equipment and supplies. At first, it was just a spark, a flicker in the darkness. But the wind fanned the flames, and soon the entire building was engulfed in fire. The overseer and several of the remaining servants rushed to contain the flames, but it was already too late. The fire spread quickly, threatening to consume the surrounding buildings. The family's plight had become even more desperate. Amid the chaos, the plantation's overseer ordered that Louisa be brought from her cell. He had made his mind up. He believed that the fire was a sign, a final push to take action. He stormed down to the storage room where Louisa was held, but when he reached the door, he found it ajar. The lock, once secure, had been undone. Louisa was gone. There was no trace of her, no footprints, no sign of struggle, nothing to explain how she had escaped. The overseer immediately launched a frantic search, calling for dogs and gathering men to scour the property. The fire still raged in the distance, its smoke curling into the sky like an ominous omen. But Louisa was nowhere to be found. The search continued through the night, through the thick rain and wind, but it was as though she had simply vanished into thin air. No one knew where she had gone. The only thing they could find was the unfinished garment she had been working on. It lay just outside the storage room, the needle still embedded in the fabric, half of the master's monogram stitched into the hem. The family's descent was now complete. Without Louisa, there was no more silent force holding them in check, no more thread weaving through the tapestry of their destruction. The plantation began to fall into disrepair. The family's sickness continued to claim their lives, one by one, until only the master remained. His mind, fractured beyond repair, wandered the halls like a ghost, muttering incoherent thoughts. His skin had taken on a yellowed, sickly hue, and his once commanding presence was now reduced to a hollow shell. He died alone, in the same bed that had once served as the seat of his power. By the time the storm passed and the fire was finally put out, the plantation was no longer a home. It was a ruin, a place that would never see prosperity again. The land, once lush and thriving, now lay in desolation. There was no sign of Louisa, no trace of her escape. Some whispered that she had drowned in the nearby creek, while others believed she had fled north, aided by those who had always known what she had done. But as time passed, Louisa's story faded into legend. Her name, if anyone had ever known it, was lost to the wind. leaving only the unsettling mystery of a woman who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the mark of her revenge. More than a century passed since the plantation was abandoned, yet the house stood as a ghost of its former self, half swallowed by ivy and rot. The white-pillared mansion that had once been a symbol of wealth and power was now a crumbling relic of an era gone by. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the windows once so clear and proud were now cracked and broken, their frames swallowed by the relentless creep of nature. It seemed as though the house itself was trying to bury its past, to forget the horrors that had taken place within its walls. But some stories refuse to be forgotten, no matter how deeply they are buried. Over the years, few had ventured near the ruins. The road leading to the plantation was overgrown, its once paved path barely discernible beneath the thick canopy of trees that had grown unnaturally close, their gnarled branches hanging low like grasping fingers. The few who dared to travel the forgotten road often turned back before reaching the house, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that seemed to press in on them. Some claimed the land was cursed, while others whispered of spirits, of a woman whose name was never spoken aloud, but whose presence was felt in the air. Louisa's story had long since slipped into myth, but the rumors surrounding the plantation were far from forgotten. Then, in 1962, a man named Calvin Murdoch purchased the land with plans to clear it for timber. As he worked through the thick underbrush and debris, he came across something unexpected, something that seemed to have been hidden, left behind for reasons unknown. Beneath the floorboards of the old sewing room, buried under layers of dust and dirt, he found a small trunk. Inside, there were scraps of fabric, each piece carefully folded and labeled with names that matched those listed in the family's burial records. Some of the pieces were stained with dark, oily smudges. When one of his workers handled the fabric, he broke out in a rash that persisted for weeks. Murdoch, unsettled, abandoned his plans for the land, leaving it to decay once more. In 1985, two anthropology students from Nashville, Annalise Turner and her partner, visited the plantation to conduct a study of local folklore. Annalise wrote in her journal about the oppressive stillness she felt as she walked through the remains of the house. She described the strange feeling that the building itself was watching her, that it was waiting for something. That night, she had vivid dreams of a woman sitting in the shadows, her eyes gleaming above a broken sewing table. Annalise never returned to the plantation. Her partner, after experiencing his own strange encounters, left in a hurry, refusing to speak of the details. Some believed they had witnessed something supernatural, something that had remained hidden in the ruins for over a century. The story of Louisa, if it was ever truly known, had become part of local legend. The plantation records had been destroyed in the war, leaving only scattered remnants, old journals, a death ledger, and a single letter from the mistress of the house. In the letter, written in trembling ink, she wrote, "She watches while we sleep. I know it now." Among the nearby black communities, the older generation still spoke of a woman who punished cruelty, slowly and silently, using the tools of the house to exact her revenge. They left small offerings, spools of thread and pieces of cloth, on their windowsills, in silent acknowledgement of the woman who had once stitched death into the fabric of the white family's fate. Though Louisa's name had been lost to time, her legacy lived on in the whispers that lingered in the area. Strange things continued to happen around the ruins. Amateur historians and ghost hunters who ventured to the plantation spoke of hearing faint stitching sounds in the dead of night, of feeling an unexplainable coldness creeping up their spines as they walked through the rooms. Every few years, a fragment of fabric would resurface, carried by some collector or unsuspecting antique dealer, each piece more unnerving than the last. Some reported unease, a sense of dread, after handling the garments. One man even claimed that his fingertips went numb after touching a bonnet from the plantation. Science could not explain it, and so the legend persisted. The plantation remained untouched, a relic of a time and a story that refused to die. Louisa's quiet rebellion, sewn into every stitch, had become a haunting reminder that some wounds never close and some hands never stop sewing.